Well, thank you everyone for coming to the Devops live meetup. Before we get started, I'm sure that you've probably already seen that on October 17th, there's going to be an all-day DevOps conference. It's all online and free. And it's going to be 24 hours of 100 speakers talking about different topics of DevOps. So, if you want, just go out to alldaydevops.com/register and then just register and then you could just see any of the sessions coming up on that channel. And that's going to be all online and it's free. So tonight we have Grant Boykin from Capital One, and he's going to talk to us about improving the developer's experience. So without further ado, I'm going to leave it here to Grant. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So my name is Grant Boykin, as he just said. I'll start by introducing myself a little. So I graduated from A&M about 5 years ago. I started working for Capital One right out of college. My degree was in information systems, so not necessarily a software engineering degree. I actually started as a BSA, which was more of a systems analyst, kind of translating requirements, things like that to different tech teams. Then I moved into like a sysadmin role, which kind of gave me a little more tech experience, if you will. And then a year after that, in our rotational program, I moved into an engineering an engineering spot, if you will. So I've kind of got the, I guess, the holistic view, if you will, from the business to tech, at least in the past couple of years. So I'll go ahead and dive in here. I'll preface this by, I'm sure y'all have seen many DevOps talks before, but there is a little Devops propaganda in this talk, if you will. So I'm sure everybody's familiar with that. My coworkers actually gave this talk or presentation or whatever you want to call it at Jenkins World a couple weeks ago, which I was also at. So this is my first time giving this one. I actually just stole all their slides. I did contribute to this particular project though, so it's okay. So as he said, okay, speak up, okay. Yeah. As he said, this talk is merely about improving the developer experience. I'm not sure how many of y'all are in more large organizations, if you will, but we tend to have a lot of bureaucracy, red tape, things like that in bigger organizations. So at Capital One, we are trying to chip away at that kind of bottleneck, if you will, of all the different fluff that application teams have to work towards to get stuff done, essentially. And this slide is essentially some of my coworkers who gave the talk. And I'll continue here. So I'll start by saying, so in DevOps, right, who necessarily is your customer? You have engineers at your company, you have IPS, site reliability engineers, people who are supporting production. Obviously, some companies have their own developers support production, but essentially you have these two sets of customers that are the customers of whatever you're delivering, right? So essentially, we want to relieve as much pain on the developers as possible in these bigger organizations. So here are some of our focus areas, right? We want to let the devs do code. We don't necessarily want them fiddling with infrastructure, having to go to 7 different teams to get stuff done. Bless you. Containerization is also another big part of our strategy. It gives you portability, etc. We don't want our devs to be afraid of releasing code, right? Nobody likes that. Nobody likes being stressed out and at midnight doing those releases. Always on, obviously your infrastructure needs to be always on. Do the right thing, not the wrong thing. Don't build a solution around, I guess, the quick way out, if you will. And finally, the biggest thing that we've been harping on lately is you build it, you own it. But it's something that Capital One personally struggles a lot with. Lots of orphaned applications. I'm sure some of y'all probably know, no team to support them. there's still a very important application that's in production, we struggle with that a lot. So this is us trying to hack away at those areas, if you will. We want to create an easy path for our developers to access various enterprise systems. Obviously, there's tons of enterprise systems, maybe not at a startup, but for this particular talk, we want to give them easier access to those. We don't want a developer having to go to 10 different teams to get stuff done. We want to be completely transparent with the pipeline, with whatever process we're creating. And we definitely want to restrict as little as possible. Developers tend to do what they want. Engineers tend to do what they want. We debated when we were creating this project pipeline, whatever you want to call it, we debated branching strategy for like a week. Like, don't make devs debate about that. It's not going to go anywhere. Artifact versioning, don't restrict that. Don't restrict a build tool. Don't make people use Maven, etc. Things like that. Security is obviously important in the financial services industry. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Containerization is a big topic lately. Kubernetes, Docker, etc. It gives you portability. Lets you do cost optimization a little easier than on-prem infrastructure. It also aligns with microservice principles a little better, and it gives you a faster time to market for your business. These were the director slides, if you will. I don't want to waste too much time on these. You build it, you own it. We have lots of legacy applications, and we're trying to get our application teams in a better spot just in terms of development and in terms of DevOps to support these types of things or to get on newer technology. So how did we do it? So we essentially had to reimagine everything. I know it sounds kind of dumb, but when you're working with lots of different engineers who come from many different areas, everybody's got their own opinion, right? Everybody's got their own thoughts. Coming up with something that's standard and easy for everybody to follow isn't always the easiest thing, but we spent some time on it, and essentially we broke it down into these 4 experiences, if you will. Okay. So if we're creating a pipeline or a way for engineers to deploy software, we want to give them a good onboarding experience. CI/CD is obviously important. Integration, deployment. We want monitoring out of the box as well. Monitoring is a topic that can get passed up when the business wants an application, out really fast, and it doesn't get captured in the requirements. Obviously, monitoring is extremely important these days. And a good release experience. We want whoever is pushing to production to have an easy time. So I'll start by going through what we did for the onboarding experience. So I'll start by saying that this whole talk is kind of about us creating like a standard pipeline, if you will, for our legacy applications as well as our newer infrastructure, so that all of our different teams could leverage it. Now, the legacy applications didn't necessarily have onboard, but all of the newer infrastructure that these teams were building essentially had to go through this onboarding experience. And you want to give them a simple UI, right? You want them to be able to easily onboard to your pipeline. Now, so this goes into a little bit about what we try to capture in our experience. So all of these different topics are things that we wanted the developers to not have to worry about, essentially. I don't know how many people are familiar with Jenkins files in here, but that tends to be a popular way to design your pipeline, right? So essentially, after the team would onboard their new API or new application, it would give them sort of a standard Jenkins file. And we're dealing with shared libraries here. So it's not like, how do I describe this? The Jenkins file out of the box that you're essentially writing Groovy yourself, and it is sort of nasty, if you will. I mean, it's code, right? So we wanted to give them a way to kind of easily create their Jenkins file out of the box. It sets up their AOBs, any kind of CNAME or endpoints that they would create, right? It creates the GitHub repo for them, gives them the webhook. So as soon as they start committing to the repo, the pipeline, it works out of the box. Observability and monitoring, like I said earlier, are extremely important in this case. We would give them monitoring out of the box. It would be part of the infrastructure that was the newer infrastructure that they were creating. And obviously you need some sort of artifact repository. So Artifactory, Nexus, whatever you want to use. We use Artifactory now, but that's what we set up in the new pipeline for them. And the last one is obviously a pretty important one, the various enterprise controls and ecosystems that they have to deal with. We wanted to remove that from the pipeline, right? Or remove the fact that they had to organize and onboard onto all these different systems, Splunk, Kibana, Access, you name it. We wanted to abstract the trouble from that. So this particular slide is essentially about exposing some of the pipeline so that the developers get a very clear message when different various things are going on. So throughout the shared libraries in the pipeline, we're essentially calling the component info. It's all stored in a database in the backend just for this particular pipeline. So the developers can essentially view the specific info, and it makes it available to everybody who's using the pipeline. This is a very cliche slide, but I'll just reiterate, it's very important to provide transparency and things like this. Sonar, your security scans, you want it all very visible to your engineers and your developers. That was sort of our onboarding goals and what we wanted to accomplish. And now I'm going to go into the CI/CD experience. So, oops, sorry. These are some of our initial challenges. So we had a huge number of jobs, obviously, very inconsistent. I'm sure most people in here know what freestyle jobs are. You can essentially, it gives the developer the complete power to do whatever they want in a Jenkins job, and there's no sort of standardization that goes along with that. So people can do, I'm not going to say dumb, but not smart things in shell and cause the master to go down, or just cause infrastructure to break in general. So we had a lot of hard-coded approaches for our CI/CD in general. Deployments weren't consistent. Any modification to the pipeline or the jobs has a big impact, obviously, and frustration among the developers because of limited capabilities with freestyle projects. So this is me right here, basically. I don't know about y'all, but I'd rather look at logs myself than going to 6 different teams to troubleshoot a particular issue, right? Nobody likes going to all these different people to debug certain things. So, so this is kind of the process that we envisioned, right? So a developer commits code to a repository. We have the Jenkins file in the back end. It's gonna trigger your webhook and essentially execute the standard pipeline that these people got after the onboarding experience. Obviously, we're using shared libraries to make writing the Jenkins file a little easier for the developers because it's not super straightforward if you're just getting started out of the box. We wanted to kind of essentially center it around less code and more configuration-based integration and deployments. I'll go back to what I said earlier about if you're just writing a Jenkins file from scratch, it can get a little messy and a little convoluted if you don't know what you're doing exactly. So essentially, we set up these shared libraries for developers to essentially pass a set of configs to a Groovy closure rather than essentially writing the Jenkins file from start to finish. Obviously, we want to run sorts of administration tasks in the background, like monitoring or transparency or messaging that we want to give to the developers as they're running their pipeline. We obviously want to provide a lot of flexibility, but we can't compromise on certain principles. We don't want people writing crazy shell scripts or not scanning their code for security issues or not running sonar for their code coverage, etc. We definitely want to capture details for audit and visibility. And so this is probably not super easy to see. So like I said earlier, we're essentially, this is a sample of one of our Jenkins files, right? If you've ever seen a Jenkins file, it looks a lot messier than this. We wanted to give them a sequential and logical way for them to pass whatever configurations they needed to the processes to deploy their API or application, run scans, etc. And obviously, we want to put controls in, right? If somebody's pushing stuff to production, we don't want them to merge their own pull request, for example. We don't want them to commit directly to a release branch and have them push something. You know, it's always good to have a second pair of eyes on it, obviously. And some additional things that we added were essentially, obviously you want to be able to define different branches that you're developing and making changes to. Essentially every time we would commit to our snapshot branch, dev branch, whatever you want to call it, kicks off the build and runs their standard pipeline. The release branch would go through a couple more, I guess, checks, if you will. Like I said earlier, we don't want them merging their own pull requests, etc. And we could apply special behavior to the hotfix branch as well. We obviously want to customize our notifications. We want to be able to send Slack messages during certain stages in the pipeline. We want to be able to send emails if something goes down, things of that nature. And essentially, this pull request closure right here is, I think it's one of the better examples of how, I guess, clean we wanted to be when people were customizing their Jenkins files. So essentially, like whenever somebody would submit a particular pull request to an application or an API, it'll run the various commands that we have defined in here. So npm install, et cetera, run. I mean, we could have a sonar closure in here that is essentially scanning the pull request for unit test coverage, things like that. So in this slide, we want it to be controlled, but flexible at the same time. So essentially, this is just like kind of an example of our logical flow that we have going on here. So we give the developers, we can use wildcards here, whatever you want to name it, essentially. So whenever they commit something to their snapshot branch, it could go and build their dev code. And if you see here, we have a post snapshot variable, whatever you want to call it, to essentially run their deployment after their new artifact is built. So it gives them kind of a logical flow. If that passes, we could do like a post-release deployment, things like that. So this slide is, it's essentially just reiterating the fact that we want our pipeline to be extremely transparent throughout what's going on in the back end. So as somebody commits code, we want the various stages of the pipeline, whatever they may be, to be transparent and to give whatever messaging or error messaging that's going on. Essentially, like I said earlier, we wanted them to pass a set of configs rather than them writing Groovy code out of the sandbox and giving them the complete flexibility to do whatever they wanted. Basically, the gist of it is we want to remove the complexity from a Jenkins file and just have the developers pass a set of configurations. This particular slide is talking about Hygeia. I'm not sure if many of y'all know what Hygeia is, but it's Capital One's open source Devops Dashboard, if you will. And it's something that we gave the developers out of the box when they onboarded. So it kind of gives you various build statistics, hooks into Sonar, Jira version 1. It can kind of give you a little insight to what's going on in your environments, in your pipelines. It's essentially another way to give feedback to the developers.
This is also available for anybody to download.
It's github.com.
GitHub.
Yep. Oh, I actually have I did not do this on purpose.
Oh, did you not?
I promise I didn't do this.
That was the way to do it. Good move. Though. Is it only like Jenkins and other friendly, or is it friendly to like the Microsoft stack as well?
So I don't know the answer to that question per se. I can certainly. I'm not on the Hygeia team, but I can hook you up with some people. I believe it's pretty agnostic.
Cool. I can download it and jack with it.
Yeah.
Because we're largely hooked into the STS and the Microsoft related.
I know Verizon and AT&T both leverage it, and I do believe they have some Microsoft infrastructure.
Thanks, man.
Can pull information from Sonar too, for code coverage and test coverage and so on.
I believe it does both those.
Yeah.
Yes.
Are you providing like a separate dashboard for every development team, or is it one global Hygeia dashboard?
They get their own essentially. Yeah.
So it's sort of like limited in scope to just their stuff. Right.
Or to their project.
Yeah, to their project.
Yeah, it's I would say it's a little more, I guess, team based rather than like, I don't know, I could ask, but I don't think we have to like giant enterprise Hygeia dashboards that are giving like all big huge statuses across the board. We try to make it as, I guess, personal and team based as possible so they can kind of work with it.
Cool. You don't have individual Jenkins forms for lines of business or groups, or you'll have a managed service that's centrally offered?
So yeah, we have an enterprise team that essentially provisions like a set of master infrastructure for each LOB. And we actually have to divide that between like applications that use NPI data versus applications that don't. They have to have separate stacks and be in separate AWS accounts. But essentially it's by LOB or mini LOBs as we call it.
And you have an onboarding process, and you provide them with the basic Jenkins template that you have not mentioned, and they can customize Jenkins file template.
So yeah, the whole Jenkins file kind of out of the box thing is something that these shared libraries would provide. The actual Jenkins infrastructure itself is provisioned by our friendly enterprise team, and we could get that done. I think their SLA is around a week for a new LOB or essentially a new department that wants to have their own master and own Jenkins infrastructure. And they try to make it as templated as possible, as agnostic as possible. So essentially it's just replications of the master and slave infrastructure across different AWS accounts. Yeah, I think the final topic we have is the release experience. Excuse me. So like I said earlier, everything obviously has to be peer reviewed. In this particular shared library, we would not let commits to the release branch process. They would get kicked out immediately if there wasn't a peer review. We wouldn't enforce that on dev or snapshot branches, just because we don't want too much red tape around it. Production changes occurs only via code changes. I think that's kind of common sense. Access to production servers is properly governed. I believe we do it through a application called Centrify, and that would be processed during onboarding. Every change goes through automated testing and scanning. This sounds straightforward, but I've seen teams that would essentially comment out or remove their sonar closure so they could get by some controls. We obviously want to put checks in our shared libraries to make sure they can't do that. We don't want anybody doing that. Sorry.
If you catch somebody doing that, you write them up?
What was that?
Do you write them up if they violate?
I mean, they go on a list, but it's kind of a mental
And it's a
list.
secret list.
A naughty list.
They might just not get support next time they ask. All activities all activities are recorded and stored for future evidence. That goes back to kind of the thing earlier about onboarding and keeping all of that in Mongo in the back end, essentially exposing as an API for developers to leverage. We obviously want blue-green in canary deployments. That is a DevOps practice, if you will.
Is that a function of the pipeline or your automated deployment tool?
It is. So essentially, the way that we would set them up, this is only for newer APIs or newer infrastructure, right? It doesn't necessarily apply to our legacy applications, but it would essentially give them the power on 2 different ECS clusters, blue, green, obviously, and I believe it would give them most of the power to do that out of the box. But yeah.
What is doing the actual deployment? Are you aware of that?
Yes. So like I said earlier, we're passing a set of configurations. All of these new APIs are going on ECS, and we essentially give them a platform or a cluster to work off of. Every time a team would onboard, they get their own ECS cluster, and it would all be managed like that. So essentially, it's CLI calls to Amazon that we're leveraging ECS commands, if you will. So they're passing a set of configs in their Jenkins file, and those get passed down and essentially deploy their infrastructure. And it's all pretty dynamic. It's not something where like they're forced to, I guess, deploy certain things or follow certain rules.
What's that last point mean?
No snowflakes in release strategy. I think this is kind of talking about maybe that manual thing that you have to, that one manual thing that has to be done during a release that seems like it's sort of offhand or doesn't flow. Like if I'm running an automated pipeline and deploying to production, why do I need to log onto this random server to run this random command to execute this random thing just to get our stack up or whatever you want to call it? Essentially, we want one button. Everybody wants one button, right? Deploy to production, blue, green, roll back if it doesn't work, things like that.
You automate the database deployments as well?
Not in this particular pipeline. When you say database,
You want to make any model changes, table changes, usually it stops there, this automated process, so the database admins can get to it manually and then they continue. But have you looked at automating the whole process and potentially when you're checking the code, you can go all the way through production?
that's an area where at least my line of business struggles and we're very tied into Oracle and stored procedures, unfortunately. We have not tackled that beast yet. We do have some RDS automation that kind of hooks into this and can give the developers sort of a standard RDS database out of the box. But no sort of like full flow from beginning to end in that regard.
Your Oracle is on AWS. Your Oracle on AWS for development? On-site, I suppose.
So we have stuff on premise and in AWS right now.
So you have a hybrid.
Yeah, we do have a hybrid model. I think we started around 2 years ago trying to lift and shift, if you will. We've made a lot of progress on our journey. We've struggled a lot, obviously. I things like 20 terabyte Oracle database don't exactly live in the cloud very well. So,
Oh, come on.
so those are,
The reason I asked that question is because you mentioned stored procedure and all that sounded very legacy.
it does. I mean,
On-site type of
we have our skeletons in the closet, if you will.
Yeah. that's-
We all-
You have a private cloud?
You mean like our private AWS accounts or? Me
No,
personally?
Your own private cloud that you manage.
Like it, data center.
No, actually, we did like, we tried we hacked at it at first. We had something called C Cloud, if you will, which was essentially our own private cloud in our data centers. That didn't last very long. We started our relationship with AWS soon after, so it kind of fizzled out there.
The last client I had, they called that the fog.
In
The
this,
cloud.
in this workflow pipeline that you have, where do you introduce security, or is it introduced in several places?
That is done by something we call Eradicode, which is an in-house application that our ISRM group created.
Okay,
So it's gonna scan. Essentially, you kind of you send a zip or a tar to an API. It absorbs it and runs various scans on the code, and it gives you it's asynchronous, so it gives you a report back pretty quick, and you can go to the Eradicode UI and kind of view all your violations in that regard.
So in the Jenkins pipeline itself, does it run in several stages, or?
Yeah, it does. So some of the legacy applications kind of take a little longer because their artifacts are a little larger in terms of that. But we do use an in-house application that does our security scanning for us.
Nice.
Does it tell you the fix?
It does not tell you the fix.
Very important, right?
It gives recommendations.
Tell me how to make that little line of code secure.
It's more of like tips and tricks and various things, and then we can engage some people with a particular request ID or some sort of unique identifier to kind of get back to us in an SLA or a time period.
And that's only static code analysis, right? It's looking at static code. It's not a dynamic scan, is it? Are you enabling that as well?
I believe that is just a static code analysis. Yes. Are you talking about like container scans and those sorts of things, or?
Well, yeah, it's looking at code to understand the vulnerabilities as opposed to deploying to an environment and then dynamically scan.
Oh yeah, no, it's actually so. I mean, we can set it up to scan on your pull request. So it's actually going to merge and create a artifact at the pull request level, and you get scanning and feedback that soon. You're not waiting to deploy the infrastructure to an environment to scan. Essentially, we don't force scanning like dev and pull requests, but it is available, and some teams do scanning at that level.
The peer review, does that create a big delay in? I mean, does it take away some of the one of your objectives was to you write it, you own it,
Yeah.
kind of thing. Does peer review kind of relieve the developer of that responsibility? I mean, I understand that peer review is a good thing. I like peer review, but
Yeah.
does somebody just write something and say, okay, there you go, what you think? And the guy's, always catches problems with that. I guess that would reflect badly on that developer if they're always turning out crappy code. But,
I mean, so I will say sometimes you're in a hurry, right? Everybody's got a deadline. It can be a little frustrating sometimes if, one of the two people that can merge your PR is on vacation and you're having to hunt somebody down. We have experienced some kind of, friction there, but we only enforce it on essentially the release branch or somebody who's trying to push code to production. So we feel that that's kind of the middle ground, if you will, in that regard.
and it's a more senior developer that has to review.
It's actually anybody who just, in this case, it's anybody who can just LGTM it and get, and essentially we just don't want people committing, directly to a release branch and trying to push something in that regard. Need a second set of eyes on it.
Do you find that that is an issue in emergent situations where you have to release a very quick hotfix?
I mean, I've certainly seen that before. We still feel that it's the best middle ground that we can kind of offer in that regard. I mean, there's obviously a workaround if it's like super urgent and somebody needs to get something out the door immediately. But yeah, there's always going to be some slight friction there with deadlines and how the business wants their things.
Is there like a team or a person that's responsible for the repo, like a repo master?
I mean,
Who makes sure that the repo is not abused and littered with crap?
I'll be honest, we don't have something like that necessarily. Yeah.
Okay. Just curious.
That'd be very nice to have that.
It would be a big responsibility. Because if somebody was real anal about the repo and somebody was violating it, they'd be like shaking their finger at them all the time.
Yeah, I mean, there's trade-offs everywhere, right? Like you gotta.
Which repo are you talking about? The artifact repository or the source code repository?
I think you're just talking about the source code repository.
Yeah, source code.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you have the developers the flexibility regarding branching and merging and so on. But then you have any standards around that, so they don't have branch sprawl, just have the simplistic, at least, branching that's necessary to give you the control. But then developers create branches willy-nilly and then have merge problems when they try to bring it in. What controls do you have in place there to make sure that they follow at least some basic standards before they flow or something like that?
Well, it was on an earlier slide, but we essentially follow this sort of 3 branching strategy. Essentially a dev, a release. Some people have a master where it's just kind of like the gold branch, if you will. After a release, they would fix that up and it would be in sync with the release branch. And then we have a hotfix branch which certain behavior can be applied to the hotfix closures to kind of expedite things that they need to be expedited. So essentially we follow kind of a maximum 3 branching strategy. The pipeline can be customized to accommodate more, but that's kind of what we stick to.
So dev, gold, and hotfix. Those are the
Yeah,
three
dev release and hotfix. Some people have a master, if you call it, that they kind of essentially manage on their own. Just yeah.
Are you using Git?
Yeah.
Do you recommend using Git flow then? Is that only that branching strategy?
It's worked pretty well with our particular shared libraries in our pipeline. I mean, back in the day, we used Subversion a lot, but I would say like 98% of our stuff is on Git now. Yeah. Let's see what this is. Oh, okay. So I believe this particular slide, it's really hard to see, but essentially this is something that would, on our newer APIs and newer infrastructure, it would essentially give our product owner, or essentially kind of our business counterpart, the ability to sign off on a deployment. So it would kind of give them the transparency to see what's going on and what the exact change that is going into production. So essentially they're accepting the risk or whatever that's going into production for that time period. And then,
So homegrown tool?
yeah, this is part of the onboarding application that is used to hook into the shared libraries. It essentially sorts it's a Mongo database in the back end. So any of these fields or any of these things can be accessed later.
And basically, it's taking the old way of having paperwork where you had a form, and now you put it on a web page, and then when they submit, it's going to lead to other processes that will.
And gives you an audit trail in the back end. Yep.
It systemizes it.
Mm-hmm.
What do you use to manage dependencies? Because unless you're deploying a microservice, the potential of dependencies are exist more often than not.
Yeah.
Do you use some kind of release orchestration tool or?
I will say we have several legacy applications that have crazy dependencies. I personally am not aware of any sort of tool that is strictly dedicated to dependency management. You have any examples
Well,
or?
like CA Technologies has one that's called ARA. IBM has a Windows deploy.
Oh yeah, I know you deploy very well.
So there are different tools like that, and I believe there's some open source ones as well that train to handle the orchestration of all the dependencies.
So I would, if you're talking about kind of like that sort of deploy orchestration where it would essentially, you would have your process flow, right? And it would do various different things throughout the process, handle different sort of situations. That is actually being, if I'm understanding this correctly, that's being handled in our Jenkins file, which we give them, a standard one out of the box. But if the developers want to customize it, if they want to deploy to a certain environment after their snapshot branch or customize which environment they're deploying to, we kind of give them that. They're essentially different various Groovy closures in the Jenkins file. So different sorts of behavior can be executed as stages during the pipeline that would handle those sorts of things. I don't think I necessarily answered the dependency management part, but that's kind of how we're orchestrating our different flow of different dependent processes. So this is essentially the kind of the out-of-the-box monitoring that we sort of gave the developers when they would onboard a new API or a new application. We wanted to make it essentially as simple as possible, and it combines some of these technologies that you see here. I believe the front end is Grafana and hooks into other various services here, but essentially we wanted to give them a very easy way for them to be able to monitor without having to add a bunch of dependencies to their POM or use Chef to install like this bulky monitoring software or something of that nature. And this is just a little snippet of the particular dependency that would have to be added to their POM. So we got by with just adding one dependency, which I think is pretty good if we're catering to 100 different development teams. And this is just a little snippet. We have traffic right here, latency, particular HTTP errors. It's sort of like CloudWatch if you've been through the AWS console before.
This is what Grafana puts out?
Yeah, so this is essentially the transactional and the network monitoring that we kind of give them out of the box with whatever API they're developing or
Gotcha.
whatever application that's being developed.
What application monitoring?
You mean like transactional monitoring or like just memory, CPU, those sorts of things?
All of those, and also transaction monitoring, and then you want to respond to any events in there. How do you already have them as part of the requirements to be onboard monitoring that they have all the events, workflow identified, all that, who gets notified, all the triggers?
We're not that good. I would say that's definitely like the golden area. We do have some stuff where we're querying Splunk for certain exceptions and certain behaviors. And if we see one of those things that arises, certain actions are kind of taken upon, like certain teams are notified, et cetera, things like that. But we're not as good as you just said. Yeah.
So it looks like in this example, you're doing a lot of, so you're measuring the calls per minute, I guess some network performance and errors. Now are these network errors or actually errors generated by whatever the code change was?
I think these are various types of HTTP errors.
Okay.
I didn't work on the monitoring piece. Very much. So I probably can't answer that.
It's okay, I was just curious.
I mean, I'm interested too, because I haven't got much feedback. I think my coworker Ishu has got more feedback on if this is actually useful for people.
That's always the question with monitoring.
Yeah,
Are you monitoring the right thing?
exactly. Like, I remember I used to mess with Nagios a lot, and it would, produce a nice dashboard, but are people going to use it? Are people going to get value out of it?
Usually management likes it because it gives them something visual
Yeah.
rather than code.
Yeah, nobody likes looking at code on a slideshow, right? Or, but yeah. So that is actually most of my presentation.
What this onboarding workflow that you talk about, is there a time lapse that you do this in, like a week, 2 weeks, before they get comfortable and start rolling it out?
When it was in its early stages, when we were kind of actually developing the application that would onboard people, it would kind of take a couple days to work the kinks out, if you will. We're down to about a business day for a new API to be onboarded successfully.
Oh, nice.
So that's going to give you like a multi-branch pipeline in Jenkins. It's going to give you a GitHub repo. It's going to give you like the users that you need to for it to programmatically commit to Git and invoke the Jenkins API, invoke the AWS CLI, things like that. So we try to do as much as we can, just taking their initial onboarding information, so they can immediately start writing code and getting feedback on their code, getting sonar scans, or the erratic code scans I was talking about earlier, static code coverage, things like that.
And you can easily add more people to that as needed?
Yeah, so if you have, essentially like when you onboard, it gives you a platform, right? You can onboard a different API to the same platform if you want.
Okay.
And when we say platform, we're essentially talking about like an ECS cluster that they can run all their different APIs off of.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's the kind of the model that we've been following so far.
Are the teams agile? Or?
We try to be.
So do you shift left performance testing, things like that? Because I mean, you look at this workflow here, Jenkins has people they're going all the way to production ready performance testing.
So, we actually leverage 7PS for performance functional, actually, it's performance functional, and load testing. So it's essentially like a wrapper around various different testing tools. This is not my strong suit. I'm trying to remember some of them. Cucumber, various different frameworks, and essentially Selenium. You could wrap a set of configs and pass it to whatever CLI or whatever executable that's going on. We made it so where it was essentially like what we call a 7PS closure in the pipeline to execute that specific set of tests. So the way that I like to describe this pipeline is essentially different building blocks. We try to get the developers very modular building blocks. Like, we give them a standard thing out of the box, right? We want to have a lot of customization, things like 7PS, sonar, and all the scans I was talking about earlier. Essentially, they're just different groovy closures where you pass a set of configs and it executes a particular functionality. And we essentially give them the power to do that at any part in their pipeline. So to answer your question, yes, I believe we are capturing that in this particular thing. That's something that is you probably don't get out of the box per se. They would have to create a 7PS closure, know what to pass to it, and to invoke the performance testing and things like that. We're growing. I mean, it's obviously really hard to capture all these different various components of an application, everything that has to be done before you go to production or things like that. Yeah, hack at it, keep hacking, we'll get there someday.
So you get in this pipeline, you have a mixture of open source and enterprise and I guess internal. So it's a little bit of everything.
If you're talking about the entire spectrum, yes. If you're just talking about the shared libraries that we developed, that's all that's all intersourced within Capital One. And I'm actually not on the same team as the people who developed the initial shared libraries.
Okay.
I'm actually in a different LOB, but we tried to make it as intersourced as possible. So I come from co-op, which is auto finance, and say auto finance needs a particular set of functionality. We would contribute back to the shared libraries and essentially create a different module that would allow us to invoke that functionality. So I'll try to give you an example. We use Chef in a lot of our legacy stuff to kind of configure legacy infrastructure, right? So we need to be able to stage and upload cookbooks, etc. So one of the things I did is I contributed a Chef module back to the shared libraries, which allowed the developers to essentially load their cookbooks at any point in the pipeline. It's a different Groovy closure where they just pass a set of configs, which can be dynamic. We can do that, and to invoke at different stages in the pipeline.
Gotcha.
I think on the early slides you mentioned SRE. Are you actually following SRE model for your production operations?
Not all of our LOBs do, but the one that I'm from does. We do have a full production support team. Yes.
Are they truly engineers? Do they write code?
Not all of them. We're still kind of in this, I guess, hybrid legacy model. Some of them do, but we do have some of the others that are still around that are more operations based. Yeah.
Sounds good. Well, thank you very much for coming. I'm going to go ahead and end the streaming now. And we'll have the slides shared. You're going to send me the slides,
Sure.
and then I can share them out on the meetup site. Thank you very much.
Thank you.